shave your head or face eviction. The words didn't just land. They cut through the air like something unreal, something that didn't belong in an ordinary neighborhood meeting. For a second, no one moved. You could feel it, that shared pause where people try to make sense of what they just heard, hoping maybe they misunderstood. But no one spoke. No one laughed, because Karen wasn't joking. She stood there, calm, composed, as she had already decided how this would go. And somehow, that made it worse. You start wondering, would you speak up or stay quiet like everyone else? Eyes shifted. People glanced at each other, silently asking the same question. How did it escalate this far? And why did it feel like saying no wasn't even an option anymore? The meeting hadn't even started properly when the emails came in urgent, all caps, demanding attendance or fines would follow. Nobody liked emergency HOA calls like this. People arrived annoyed, already expecting another pointless argument about parking or lawn rules. But the moment Karen walked in, the energy shifted. She looked different tonight, softer, almost fragile. Then she said it. Her daughter had cancer. Just like that, the irritation in the room dissolved into silence. Chairs stopped moving, voices dropped, and sympathy filled the space almost instantly. You could see people rethinking everything they had ever said about her, and that's when she changed the tone again. She explained that this wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a community moment. Then came the rule. Every resident was expected to shave their head in solidarity, no exceptions. She called it unity, healing, respect. But behind those words was something else. When people hesitated, she reminded them of HOA authority, fines, and enforcement powers like they were tools already waiting to be used. Sympathy was still in the air, but now it had a price attached to it. At first, it felt unreal, like something people would talk about for a few hours and then forget. But by the next morning, the change had already begun. One house down the street, a man stepped outside with a freshly shaved head, avoiding eye contact like he was carrying shame instead of hair. Then another, and another. It didn't take long before the neighborhood started transforming in ways no one had expected. The HOA group chat, once filled with complaints about trash pickup and noise, was now flooded with photos of shaved heads and messages praising true unity. Karen reacted to each one with approval, calling it inspiring, calling it proof of real community spirit. Slowly, that approval became pressure. If you hadn't complied, you weren't just different, you were being watched. People started looking at each other differently, noticing who still had hair, judging silently. Conversations became shorter, more careful. The ones who refused were no longer just residents, they were problems. I kept mine. That decision felt smaller at first, but it didn't stay that way. The silence around me grew heavier, as the neighborhood had quietly agreed to exclude anyone who didn't follow along. And for the first time, I understood what isolation really feels like when it's enforced without a single word being spoken. At some point, sympathy stopped being enough to explain what I was seeing. The story didn't add up anymore. Everyone had accepted it, moved on, even acted on it. But the details were strangely empty when I thought about them closely. No one had actually seen medical proof. No reports, no hospital confirmation, nothing beyond Karen's words repeated back through fear and authority. And the daughter herself, Laura, she was never there. Not once. Not at meetings, not in passing, not even in the background of any story someone casually mentioned. When I asked simple questions, people hesitated before answering, like they were afraid of sounding disrespectful rather than uncertain. Karen, of course, had an answer for everything, but every answer felt rehearsed. If someone asked about treatment, she said privacy matters. If someone asked about timing, she said healing is unpredictable. If someone asked for proof, she turned it into an attack on compassion. And slowly, questioning anything started to feel uncomfortable for everyone except me. That's when something shifted internally. I stopped trying to fit the story into what I wanted to believe and started looking at what was actually there. Or more accurately, what wasn't. And once you notice an absence like that, it doesn't stay quiet in your mind anymore. I stopped confronting her after that. It wasn't fear exactly, it was strategy. Every time Karen was challenged directly, she turned it into something emotional, something loud, something that pulled everyone back into her version of the story. So instead, I stayed quiet and started paying attention in a different way. I went back to everything I could remember, replaying conversations in my head like evidence. The hospital names she had mentioned changed depending on the day. The timelines shifted slightly whenever someone questioned them. Even the way she described her daughter's condition felt inconsistent if you listened closely enough. Nothing matched perfectly, but it was all close enough for people not to question it. I started making small, indirect calls, not accusations, just inquiries, questions about policies, about admissions, about whether names like the one she mentioned even showed up in their system. Most of the time, I didn't get answers, but I did get reactions. Hesitations. Redirects. A sense that something wasn't as clean as it was being presented. Then came the moment that changed everything. A neighbor mentioned almost casually that they had seen Laura, not in a hospital, not in distress, at a grocery store across town, laughing, healthy, hair untouched. At first, I almost dismissed it because rumors spread fast in places like this. But something about the way they said it didn't feel like gossip. It felt specific. That was the first real crack. I didn't act on it immediately. I just collected it, added it to everything else I'd noticed, and stepped back. And once you start seeing the pattern instead of the story, everything begins to look different. The pieces don't just sit there anymore. They start pointing somewhere. I didn't confront her right away. I needed to be certain I wasn't just connecting dots that weren't there. But when I finally did speak to Karen, I kept my voice calm, almost careful. I asked simple questions, nothing accusatory, just clarity. About the diagnosis, about the hospital, about the process she kept referring to. The reaction came instantly. Her calm cracked. Not fully at first, just enough to notice. Then the tone shifted. She accused me of being cruel, of disrespecting a sick child, of turning personal tragedy into suspicion. The louder she got, the more the room seemed to shrink around her words. And strangely, that reaction said more than anything she actually answered. That night, I went back to the hospital contact again, this time more direct, explaining how the situation was being used in the community. It took longer this time, but something changed. Someone listened differently. A doctor eventually agreed not to expose anything private, but to clarify what had actually been said and what hadn't. And he agreed to come to the next HOA meeting, just once, to set the record straight. And suddenly, everything felt like it was leaning toward something none of us could step away from anymore. The next HOA meeting felt different the moment people walked in. There was no usual chatter, no casual complaints, just tension. Karen sat at the front like nothing had changed, clipboard in hand, eyes steady, already performing her version of reality. When she spoke, her voice carried the same confidence as before. She repeated the same claims, the same emotional framing, the same demand for unity through sacrifice. And for a moment, it almost worked again. You could see hesitation returning to the room, that familiar pull of guilt and sympathy trying to take over. Then the door opened. The doctor didn't speak immediately. He just walked in quietly, which somehow made everyone pay attention more than if he had announced himself. Karen noticed him late, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted, just a flicker of uncertainty. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, professional, and completely detached from emotion. He said he wasn't there to discuss personal matters or reveal private details. He was there only to clarify what had and hadn't been medically stated. And then he said it clearly. There was no cancer diagnosis, no confirmation, no chemotherapy plan, no medical instruction for head shaving. Nothing justified what had been done in his name. The room changed instantly. It didn't erupt at first. It froze, like everyone was trying to process the gap between what they had believed and what they were hearing. Karen stood up abruptly, her voice breaking as she tried to interrupt, to regain control, to turn the moment back into accusation. But it wasn't working anymore. The authority she had built everything on was gone in a single explanation. When she started shouting, someone had already called the police. And this time, no one defended her. By the time the officers arrived, the atmosphere had completely shifted. There was no confusion anymore, no debate, no room left for interpretation. Statements were taken quickly, voices overlapping as people tried to explain how it had all escalated so far. The doctor repeated what he had already said, calmly and without emotion, and that alone seemed to carry more weight than anything else in the room. Karen didn't stop talking, even as she was being asked to step outside. She kept trying to defend herself, raising her voice, shifting blame, insisting it was all misunderstood. But no one was listening the same way anymore. The words didn't land like they used to. The control she once had over the room had fully collapsed. When she was officially taken into custody, the charges were already being outlined: fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority tied to false enforcement actions. The HOA board moved quickly after that. Her position was removed, all fines were reversed, and the penalties she had enforced began to unravel almost instantly. Outside, the neighborhood stood in silence. People looked at each other differently now, some still touching the shaved heads they had once thought were necessary. There was disbelief, but also something heavier: realization, because in the end, it wasn't just about one person lying. It was about how easily fear had turned into obedience when no one questioned it in time. And long after everything ended, one question stayed in the air louder than the rest: how quickly. Truth gets ignored when fear takes its place. People went back to their homes, but nothing felt the same anymore. Even silence felt different now. Like it had been part of the problem all along. Power can make almost anything feel normal, even when it clearly isn't. So here's the question that remains. Would you have shaved your head just to avoid conflict? Or would you have stood your ground when it mattered most? Let me know in the comments what you think. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life inspired HOA drama stories like this.